She was standing in a stranger's kitchen, checking the salmon, adjusting the garnish, doing the job she had built from nothing over 14 years. And then her server walked in, pale, quiet, holding a piece of paper like it was something that could bite. She read it once, then twice. Then the room stopped making sound, because the name on that guest book, her last name, the name she had carried for 19 years, was signed by a woman she had never met, at a vow renewal ceremony, for a man she had gone home to every night for nearly 2 decades. Her husband was in the next room, renewing his vows to someone else. And here is the part that will change how you think about everything that comes next. She did not run. She did not scream. She did not fall apart in the middle of a catering kitchen in Westchester County on a Friday night with 187 guests waiting for their third course. She finished plating every single dish. And then she went to war. What you are about to hear is not just a story about betrayal. It is a blueprint, a masterclass in what a woman can do when she finally understands exactly what has been done to her and decides, quietly and completely, that she is not going to accept it. Stay with me, because the twist that comes 48 minutes into this story will change everything you think you already know. This story will show you that the most powerful thing you can do after being deceived is not to fall apart. It is to think clearly, document everything, and understand that the person who tried to erase you made one fatal mistake. They underestimated you. That mistake is going to cost them everything. And before we begin, if you have ever trusted someone completely and discovered that trust was being used against you, if you have ever built something real and watched someone try to take it, this story was made for you. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every week we bring you stories like this one. Stories about ordinary people who discovered extraordinary strength exactly when they needed it most. Stories that might arrive at exactly the right moment in your own life. Now, let us begin. Picture this. A woman stands in a commercial kitchen at 5:47 in the morning, and the world outside is still dark, and the city hasn't woken up yet, and she is already working. Her name is Rachel Calloway. She is 42 years old. She has calluses on her right hand from years of carrying stainless steel trays and burn scars on her left forearm from a moment of distraction in 2011 that she has never quite forgiven herself for. She is 5'6". She hasn't had a full 8 hours of sleep in 11 days. And she is checking truffle salmon canapes that could honestly be mistaken for museum art. Tonight, her catering company is handling what her event coordinator described as the most important booking of the year, 200 guests, a private estate in Westchester County, New York, a vow renewal ceremony for a couple so private, so carefully guarded, that they refused to give Rachel's team the hosts' names in advance. Just a wire transfer for $40,000 and one instruction: perfection, or don't bother showing up. Rachel Calloway has never failed a client. She doesn't know yet that tonight she won't just be failing a client. Tonight she will be catering her own husband's secret wedding. And when she sees the name in the guest book, her name, her married name, signed by a woman who is most certainly not her, Rachel will understand something so devastating that her legs will simply stop working. Not from weakness, from the specific kind of shock that the human body produces when the entire architecture of a person's reality comes apart at once. The man she has been married to for 19 years has been living a completely different life, and that is only the first thing she will discover tonight. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something important. This is not a story about a woman who was naive. This is not a cautionary tale about someone who missed the signs and should have known better. I am not going to spend the next hour and 40 minutes suggesting that Rachel Calloway deserved what happened to her because she wasn't paying close enough attention. Rachel Calloway is one of the most capable, most clear-eyed women I have ever had the privilege of telling a story about. What happened to her is proof that the most dangerous lies are not the ones we believe because we are foolish. They are the ones we believe because we love someone, and love, real love, the kind that accumulates over 19 years of ordinary Tuesday mornings and shared grocery lists and watching someone sleep and thinking you know every breath they take. That kind of love rewires the parts of your brain that's supposed to protect you. This is her story. And if something in it feels familiar, if some part of what you are about to hear sounds uncomfortably close to something you have lived, I need you to stay with me until the very end. Because Rachel's ending matters, and so does yours. Let me tell you who Rachel Calloway was before the night everything shattered. She grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, the daughter of a high school cafeteria manager named Carol Ann and a man named James who fixed HVAC systems for 26 years without once calling in sick. Her family wasn't poor, exactly, but they understood money the way people do when there is never quite enough of it, carefully, respectfully, without waste. Carol Ann Whitfield made everything from scratch. Sunday dinners in the Whitfield house were events. Thanksgiving was legendary. People drove 2 hours to attend Carol Ann's Christmas Eve open house. And Rachel grew up understanding, on a cellular level, that food was love made visible. That feeding people well was one of the most meaningful things a human being could do with their time on earth. She earned a scholarship to UNC Chapel Hill, studied hospitality management, and graduated with honors. Then she spent 3 years working every miserable entry level job the restaurant industry had to offer. And she did it deliberately, because she believed you could not run something you didn't understand from the inside out. She was a prep cook. She was a dishwasher's assistant when they were short staffed, and she was the only one available. She managed front of house at a mid range bistro in Raleigh that smelled permanently of industrial cleaner and broken air conditioning. She learned how the business worked by doing every part of it herself. She met Thomas Calloway at a charity auction she was working as extra staff. He was 31. Handsome in the way of men who have always been told they are handsome. Charming in the particular way that fills a room without anyone being entirely sure how. He bid on a dinner for 10 package that Rachel's boss had donated, and when he came to arrange the details, he kept finding reasons to come back. Within 6 months, they were together. Within a year, they were engaged. Rachel's mother liked Thomas. That matters more than it might seem, because Carol Ann Whitfield had what people in Asheville called a gift. She could see through most human beings the way sunlight passes through glass. She had called every bad boyfriend Rachel ever brought home within 15 minutes of meeting them, and she had been right every single time. Carol Ann liked Thomas. She said he reminded her of the kind of man who gets things done. She was right about that. Thomas got things done. He was just very careful about making sure Rachel never knew exactly what things he was getting done, or for whom, or why. They married in the fall of 2005 at a small church outside Asheville. 80 guests, catered by Rachel herself, because she wouldn't hear of letting anyone else handle the food at her own wedding. Their son Owen was born 2 years later, a serious, watchful baby who grew into a serious, watchful boy who would one day ask his mother questions she had to answer honestly even when honesty was hard. Thomas's real estate development company began growing around the same time Owen arrived, and for several years. Everything looked exactly like the life Rachel had imagined when she was 22 and just beginning to understand what she wanted. She launched Calloway and Company Catering in 2009, the worst possible year to start a business. Thomas told her she was being reckless. She did it anyway. By 2013, she had a staff of 12, a commercial kitchen in Westchester County, and a client list that included 3 Fortune 500 companies and the governor's office. She built something real. She did it while Thomas traveled constantly for work, while she raised Owen mostly alone during the weeks Thomas was away. while she handled the household finances and Owen's school meetings and the dog's vet appointments and the gutters that needed cleaning and the furnace that needed replacing. While her mother in law, Helen, made increasingly pointed comments about how Rachel seemed to prioritize her business over her family. She did all of it. She thought they were happy. She had absolutely no way of knowing that for at least 7 of those years, Thomas Calloway had been maintaining an entirely separate life, 95 miles away in Philadelphia, where a woman named Brianna Walsh had been introduced to an entire social and business community as his wife. The night began like any other large event. Rachel arrived at the Whitmore estate in Bedford, New York at 3:30 in the afternoon with 2 vans, a staff of 8, and the controlled energy she always brought to a major booking. She had done this 400 times, give or take. She knew how to walk into a stranger's space and make it produce something beautiful. The estate was stunning in the way of old Westchester money. 12 acres. A Georgian colonial main house with white columns and dark shutters. Formal gardens that someone clearly paid a great deal to maintain. A reception tent in the east garden that could seat 250 comfortably, strung with warm lights that would look lovely in the photographs. The venue coordinator was a young woman named Ashley who met Rachel at the service entrance with a clipboard and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She gave the team kitchen access, handed over the final guest count, 187 confirmed, and reminded Rachel of the unusual privacy clause in the contract. No photographs by any vendor staff, no social media posts mentioning the event, no names shared outside the immediate logistics team. Any vendor who posted about the event would be in material breach of contract and subject to full financial penalties. Rachel had seen requests like that before. Wealthy clients guarded their privacy as carefully as their assets. She signed the acknowledgement without thinking twice about it. Her team moved through the afternoon with the efficiency of people who had done this work long enough to make it look effortless. By 5 o'clock, the kitchen was organized and running. By 6, guests were beginning to arrive, and Rachel could hear the low hum of conversation from the tent. The kind of sound a room makes when it is filling with people who are comfortable spending money and expect their comfort to be maintained invisibly. Rachel stayed in the kitchen. She always preferred the back of house on large events. She could control quality there. She could catch problems before they became visible. She was plating the third course when her lead server, Tyler, appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was pale in a way that had nothing to do with the lighting. Rachel looked up from the plate in her hands. "What is it?" "Rachel," his voice was strange. Not urgent exactly. More like careful. "I'm in the middle of the salmon." "Rachel." He said her name again. Differently. The way you say a person's name when you need them to stop doing the thing they are doing and pay attention to something more important. "Please come with me." She set down the plate. She followed him. He led her to a small alcove near the main entrance hallway, a graceful little space with a side table, a flower arrangement, and a guest book opened flat for arrivals to sign. Tyler pointed to the printed program that had been tucked inside the front cover of the guest book. Rachel picked it up. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, embossed at the edges, the kind of stationery that communicated significance. She read the first line, "Thomas and Brianna Calloway." She read it again. "Thomas and Brianna Calloway request the honor of your presence as they renew their vows and celebrate 20 years of love, family, and building a life together." And there, on the inside cover, was a photograph, the kind of soft focus portrait that appears on the front of anniversary cards in drugstore displays. A couple, positioned in filtered afternoon light, leaning toward each other with the ease of people who have been photographed together many times and are comfortable with being seen. The man in the photograph was her husband. He looked younger than she remembered seeing him look recently. Lighter somehow. The way a person looks when they are not carrying the weight of a particular lie. The woman beside him was 31 years old. Rachel would learn later. Dark blonde hair, attractive in a natural way, wearing a cream dress that matched the stationery. She was smiling at the camera with the open, unguarded expression of a woman who had no idea there was anything in her life that should make her afraid. The kitchen sounds continued behind Rachel. Her staff was still working. The timer she had set for the salmon was still counting down. She stood in the alcove and held the program and did something she would not understand until much later. She read it a third time, as though the words might be different on the third reading, as though there might be an explanation hiding inside the sentences that would make this make sense. Here is something worth understanding about the moment Rachel stood in that alcove. When the human brain receives information that directly contradicts the entire framework of a person's life, it does not immediately process that information as a crisis. It processes it as an error, a malfunction, something that must have a logical explanation that has not yet been identified. This is not weakness. This is the brain protecting itself from a shock it isn't yet equipped to absorb. Rachel's first thought was that there must be another Thomas Calloway, a different man with the same name, living in Westchester, renewing vows at an estate her company had been hired to cater. This was statistically improbable, but not technically impossible, and her mind held on to it for approximately 4 seconds before the photograph made it impossible. Her second thought was that she needed to go back to the kitchen. There were 187 people waiting for their third course. She went back to the kitchen. She plated every remaining course with the precision she had spent 14 years developing. Her hands did not shake. Her voice did not waver when she directed her team. Her staff would tell each other afterward, in the weeks when the story became something people talked about, that she had been completely professional, completely composed, completely Rachel. Inside, she was dismantling 19 years of memory, one piece at a time, looking for the lie she had apparently been living inside for longer than she knew. At 9:45 in the evening, Thomas entered the kitchen. He was laughing at something a man beside him had said. His hand was on the other man's arm, the easy physical comfort of someone who feels entirely safe in a room. He walked through the door of the kitchen at his own estate without any apparent concern. And then he came face to face with his wife of 19 years, standing 6 feet away in a catering uniform, with his program in her apron pocket. The laugh stopped. The color left his face. And in the 3 seconds before either of them spoke, Rachel watched her husband's eyes do something she had never seen them do in all the years she had known him. They calculated, not panic, not guilt, not the shattered horror of a man confronted with a catastrophic mistake. Calculation. The rapid, practiced assessment of a man who has been managing complicated situations for a long time and has always found a way through them. Rachel, he said her name the way you say the name of someone you are trying to calm before they do something you would rather they didn't do. Don't. Her voice was quieter than she expected. This is not what you. Thomas. She set down the serving tray with a gentleness that surprised even her. She had been afraid that when this moment came, whatever moment came, she would be loud, or she would be broken, or she would do something she couldn't take back. She was none of those things. I need you to not lie to me right now. I need you to understand that whatever comes out of your mouth in the next 30 seconds is going to determine something very important. He looked at her. She looked at him. Who is she? Rachel said. And Thomas Calloway, her husband of 19 years, the father of her son, the man she had believed in when no one else did and supported through failures that would have ended a lesser person's ambition, said the one thing she was least prepared to hear. She's my wife. Not his girlfriend. Not a mistake. Not an affair that had gone further than he intended. His wife, Brianna Walsh Calloway, 31 years old, had been known to the Philadelphia business and social community as Thomas's wife for the past 7 years. Joint bank account. Co-signed mortgage on a property in Society Hill. A shared calendar. Shared friends. Shared holidays. A shared life that was, by every measurable standard of the people who inhabited it, completely real, except that it was not legal, because Rachel was still his wife, which meant that Thomas Calloway had committed bigamy. Rachel left the estate without saying another word to Thomas. She drove home 40 minutes on a road she had driven hundreds of times, and she had no memory of any of it. She parked in her driveway, sat a car for a long time with the engine off, walked inside to a dark, quiet house. Owen was staying at a friend's. She sat at the kitchen table, opened her laptop, and started looking. What Rachel found in those first hours gave her something she hadn't felt since the night at the estate: hope, not the fragile, careful kind, the kind that arrives with documentation attached, the kind that has weight and substance and the feel of something you can stand on. She found them methodically, one after another, across 4 hours of searching. Joint tax returns filed under both addresses, New York and Philadelphia, with Thomas's social security number appearing on both. Brianna Walsh's social media accounts, entirely public, populated with years of photographs captioned with Rachel's married name. A Philadelphia property deed listing both Thomas Calloway and Brianna Walsh Calloway as joint owners. A life insurance policy, discoverable through a document Thomas had left in a shared cloud folder he had apparently forgotten Rachel could access, listing Brianna as primary beneficiary under the name Brianna Calloway. 7 years of a parallel life, documented as thoroughly as any legitimate marriage. She spent 3 days compiling everything before she made a single call. She printed documents. She saved screenshots to 3 separate email accounts. She wrote a chronology, dates and facts and sources, the way she would write a timeline for a complex catering event. Because structure was how Rachel Calloway held herself together when everything else was coming apart. On the 4th day, she called Diane Foster, a family law specialist in White Plains who came recommended by Rachel's accountant, a woman whose judgment Rachel trusted entirely. Diane was sharp, experienced. She had the particular directness of an attorney who no longer needed to soften difficult truths for clients because she had discovered long ago that clarity served everyone better than comfort. She reviewed Rachel's documents for 45 minutes in silence. Then she looked up. This is actually fairly straightforward. Legally, Diane's voice was precise. Bigamy is a criminal offense in the state of New York. You have clear grounds for an annulment as well as a divorce filing. Assets acquired during the course of your marriage are subject to equitable distribution under New York law. And the documentation you've assembled is excellent. She paused. Your position is very strong, Rachel. Rachel felt something shift in her chest, the physical sensation of a weight being partially lifted. The first full breath she had taken in 4 days. She had the evidence. She had an attorney. She had the facts on her side and documentation to prove it. She thought, for the first time since the estate, that she was going to be all right. She was wrong. On the morning she was scheduled to review the formal filing with Diane, her phone rang at 8:15. Not Diane. Diane's paralegal, a quiet, professional young man named Scott. Miss Calloway, I'm so sorry to be calling you like this. His voice was careful in a way that communicated something he was not saying directly. Miss Foster has had to withdraw from your case effective immediately. She's unable to provide any explanation for the withdrawal, but she wanted me to make sure you received a full refund of your retainer before the end of business today. Rachel went very still. We have a meeting in 3 hours. Scott. I know. She asked me to express how sorry she is. There was something in how he said it. Not the scripted apology of an office handling routine business. The careful voice of a person who knows more than they are permitted to say and is doing their best to communicate that gap without crossing a line. Can you tell me anything else? Rachel said. A pause. I really can't. Miss Calloway. I'm sorry. She thanked him and ended the call. That evening, she was at the grocery store when she ran into a woman she knew slightly from a charity board they had both served on 2 years ago. Margaret Elborn, a family law attorney herself. Someone Rachel had exchanged pleasantries with at quarterly meetings, but never known well. Margaret pulled her aside near the produce section with an urgency that surprised Rachel. I heard something today. Margaret's voice was low. About your situation. I can't tell you how, and I won't be repeating it. But I want you to be careful. Someone made calls about your case. Someone with connections to the Judicial Conduct Commission. She looked at Rachel steadily. Diane Foster didn't withdraw because she wanted to. Rachel stood among the oranges and understood something she had not understood before. Thomas hadn't just been building a second life in Philadelphia for 7 years. He had been building a firewall, a network of pressure and leverage and quiet threat that extended far beyond anything Rachel had imagined, into corners of the legal system she hadn't even known to worry about. She stood in the grocery store with a bag of oranges she had forgotten she was holding and thought about 19 years of a marriage she had believed was one thing and was apparently something else entirely. Something she was only now beginning to see the actual shape of. She put the oranges back. She walked out to her car. She sat in the parking lot and allowed herself exactly 12 minutes to feel the full weight of what she was facing. Then she started making a new plan. There is something I want to say to you here, directly, before we go any further. If you have ever discovered that a person you trusted had been deceiving you for years, you know what the next phase feels like. Not the initial shock. That passes into something quieter and, in some ways, more difficult. The slow, grinding realization that the deception was not an accident or a weakness, but a system. That the person who deceived you had been actively maintaining and protecting that deception, making choices every single day to keep you in the dark, investing real effort and real resources into making sure you never found out. That realization does not arrive all at once. It arrives in pieces, each piece worse than the last. Rachel was still collecting pieces. She went through 2 more attorneys over the following 3 weeks. The first withdrew after citing an unspecified conflict of interest he could not elaborate on. The second took the case, began preparing the filing, and then received something he described only as information that makes my continued representation of you inadvisable. The third attorney was different. His name was Gerald Warren, a solo practitioner in Yonkers who had spent 30 years doing family law and had long since stopped being impressed by people with money. He took Rachel's documents, read them, took her retainer, and then called her the following Tuesday. I need to ask you something directly, he said. Do you know what your husband has on Diane Foster? I have no idea, Rachel said. Gerald was quiet for a moment. You might want to find out, because whatever it is, he's using the same thing or the threat of it on anyone you approach. This isn't legal maneuvering. This is suppression. He paused. And whoever is helping him do it has access to the Judicial Conduct Commission, which means Thomas Calloway has either paid someone or is holding something over someone at that level. Rachel sat at her kitchen table with the phone against her ear and felt something she had been keeping carefully at bay begin to press against the walls she had built around it. Not fear, not grief. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been fighting very hard and has just realized the opponent has been preparing far longer than they knew. She thanked Gerald. She ended the call. She sat alone in her kitchen in the house she had lived in for 11 years. And then she called Maggie Sinclair. Maggie Sinclair had known Rachel since the Raleigh Bistro days, when they were both 24 and working jobs that paid just enough to make them feel like they were moving forward. Maggie had been a researcher at a local news station then. She was an investigative producer now at a station in New York, and she had spent 16 years developing the specific skill set of a person who finds things that other people have spent money and effort to keep hidden. They met at a coffee shop in Tarrytown on a Wednesday morning, and Rachel told her everything from the estate, the guest book, the conversation in the kitchen, the 7 years of a parallel marriage, the attorneys who had withdrawn without explanation, the pressure on the Judicial Conduct Commission. All of it. In the methodical, chronological way Rachel organized information, Maggie listened without interrupting. She was one of the few people Rachel had ever known who could do that, who could receive a complex story without needing to respond to each piece as it arrived, who could hold the whole thing and let it settle before she spoke. When Rachel finished, Maggie picked up her coffee cup and held it without drinking from it. Tom Calloway, she said, real estate developer, Westchester base, Philadelphia operations. Yes, we did a story 2 years ago. She set the cup down, a mixed-use development in Chester County, Pennsylvania. There were irregularities in the permitting process. His name came up, but we couldn't pin anything down. He was very well lawyered, and then some of our sources went quiet in a way that made our legal team nervous. Rachel leaned forward slightly. What kind of irregularities? The kind where money moves from a development LLC into a city council member's personal consulting firm right before a zoning variance gets approved. Maggie's voice was precise. And where a whistleblower inside the company files an internal complaint and is terminated for performance issues the following week. Who was the whistleblower? His name was Richard Harmon. He worked as Thomas's CFO for 6 years. After Thomas filed a confidentiality breach lawsuit against him, he essentially disappeared. I haven't been able to locate him in about 18 months. Rachel looked at her. Can you find him now? Maggie studied her for a long moment. The way journalists sometimes look at a source when they are deciding how much to invest in what comes next. Then she said, "Give me 48 hours." Rachel spent those 48 hours doing what she always did when she needed to think clearly. She worked. She ran a corporate luncheon for 60 people on Thursday and a rehearsal dinner for 42 on Friday night. And she managed both events with the professional steadiness her staff depended on. And she did not tell any of them what was happening in her personal life, because the company was the one thing she still controlled completely, and she intended to keep it that way. On Saturday morning, Maggie called. I found Richard Harmon. He's living outside Poughkeepsie. He was not easy to locate, which is itself interesting, because people who are easy to locate tend to be people who don't have anything worth hiding from. Does he know I want to meet him? He knows someone does. He's cautious. But he agreed to a meeting. She paused. Rachel, whatever he knows. He's been sitting on it for a long time. People who sit on things that long are usually just waiting for someone to ask the right question. They arranged to meet at a diner outside Poughkeepsie the following Tuesday morning. Rachel drove up alone. She spent the drive thinking about the shape of what she was beginning to understand about Thomas. Not Thomas the husband, the man she had slept beside and raised a son with, and believed she knew in the cellular way of people who have shared ordinary life for a very long time. But Thomas the operator, the person who had constructed a firewall that could pressure attorneys and reach the Judicial Conduct Commission and cause people to disappear into quietness. That Thomas was someone she did not know at all. And the question she had not yet answered, the one that was beginning to concern her more than any of the others, was this. What was he protecting? Not the bigamy alone. That was damaging but manageable for a wealthy man with good lawyers. Not the LLC manipulation she was only beginning to suspect. Something larger. Something that required the kind of infrastructure Thomas had apparently spent years quietly building. The diner outside Poughkeepsie was the kind of place that looked the same at 7 in the morning as it did at 7 in the evening. Fluorescent lights and laminate tables and coffee that arrived without being asked for. Rachel got there early. She sat in a booth by the window and watched the parking lot. Richard Harmon arrived at 9:10, driving a car that was 7 or 8 years old and had the slightly worn look of a man who had once had access to better things and no longer did. He was 47, thin in a way that suggested the weight had come off in the past few years and had taken some other things with it. He scanned the diner when he walked in the way people do who have spent time being careful about where they sit and who can see them. He sat across from Rachel and wrapped both hands around the coffee mug the server had already placed in front of him. And he looked at her the way people do when they are deciding how much truth to give. I signed an NDA, he said, 7 years ago. The lawsuit was settled with a confidentiality clause. I know. If I talk to you, Thomas could come after me again. He probably will, Rachel said. But I think you've been waiting to talk to someone who would actually do something with what you know. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that stopped Rachel's heart. Did you know your catering company isn't actually yours? The diner kept moving around her. A server refilled coffee at a nearby table. Someone's phone rang near the register. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning. Rachel sat very still. What did you say? Richard Harmon pulled a manila envelope from the inside of his jacket and laid it on the table between them. He did not slide it toward her. He left it there, as though giving her the choice to reach for it or not. Thomas registered a parent company 7 years ago, he said. Callaway Hospitality Group, LLC. Your catering business, Callaway and Company Catering, was restructured as a subsidiary of that entity. The operating agreement was filed using your signature. My signature, matched from documents you had signed previously. Richard said, routine business things, things you signed during busy periods, without reading every page, because he was your husband and you trusted him. He watched her face. The documents look legitimate because your signature is legitimate. But you never knowingly authorized the restructuring. You didn't know it happened. Rachel's hands were flat on the table. She was aware of keeping them flat. Anyone examining the corporate structure sees your name. Richard continued. But Thomas controls the LLC. The kitchen equipment, the commercial lease, the client contracts, the brand, all of it held by an entity he controls entirely. How long? Her voice was very quiet. 7 years. He started building it right around the time your business took off, when it became clear that Callaway and Company was going to be worth something. 14 years. She had spent 14 years building that company. She had worked the dishwasher shifts and the rejected proposals and the years of showing up before dawn and leaving after midnight. She had hired staff and trained them and invested in equipment and built a client list through nothing but the quality of her work and the reliability of her word. And Thomas had quietly, surgically removed it from under her without her knowledge, without her consent, over 7 years of ordinary Tuesday mornings and shared grocery lists, while she was sleeping next to him and trusting him with her name. He's done this to others. Richard said. His voice was not unkind, but it was direct in the way of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has decided the time for gentleness has passed. The Chester County investors. I watched it happen. They thought they owned equity in the development. The LLC structure gave Thomas sole authority over asset disposition. When the project ran into trouble, he moved the valuable assets into a separate subsidiary before anyone realized what was happening. The investors were left with the liabilities and an empty shell. Rachel looked at him. How many people? Richard was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee. That I know about with certainty, including you and Brianna Walsh. He paused. 4 women. Rachel thought about 4 women. She thought about them individually, each one a person with a name and a history and a specific investment, financial or emotional or both, that Thomas had quietly transferred to himself while they weren't looking. She thought about all the things those 4 women had in common with each other and with her. They had trusted him. That was all. They had simply trusted him. Here is something I want to say directly to you at this point in Rachel's story. There is a particular kind of shame that arrives when you discover you have been deceived by someone you trusted. It is not a reasonable shame. It is not based in anything you actually did wrong, but it is very real, and it is powerful. And it is specifically designed by the people who deceive us to prevent us from fighting back. Because shame is quiet. And quiet is exactly what people like Thomas Calloway need their victims to be. Rachel Calloway felt that shame. She sat in a diner in Poughkeepsie with Richard Harmon's documents in front of her, and she felt the specific burning of a person who has discovered that her trust was used as a mechanism against her. And she recognized that the shame she felt was manufactured, designed, intended. And then she set it aside, carefully, deliberately, with the same efficiency she brought to every other problem in her professional life. She picked up the manila envelope. "What else?" she said. Richard told her about the deed of trust on the Westchester estate that used, as collateral, a portfolio of properties across 4 states. He told her about shell companies registered in Delaware whose operating addresses were mailboxes. He told her about transfer documents that moved assets between entities just quickly enough to stay ahead of any individual investigation. And then he told her the thing that explained the attorneys. "Thomas has a relationship with a man named Wallace Pruitt," Richard said. "Pruitt is a fixer. I don't mean that as a metaphor. He has spent 20 years cultivating relationships with people in positions that matter, and he calls in those relationships when clients like Thomas need specific outcomes. He has handled at least 2 judicial assignment situations that I know of directly. He is the reason your attorneys withdrew." Rachel absorbed this. "I'm going to need an attorney who doesn't already know Thomas's name," she said. Richard nodded. "And she's going to need to file in a way that doesn't give Thomas time to mobilize Pruitt before the initial filing is sealed." Rachel looked at the documents in her hands. She thought about the spreadsheet she was going to build when she got home, the map she was going to draw of every entity, every connection, every thread she could identify. She thought about what she had built over 14 years and what it had cost her and what it meant. Then she thanked Richard Harmon, paid for both coffees, and drove back toward Westchester with the envelope on the passenger seat and a plan beginning to form in the methodical, competent, forward-moving part of her mind that Thomas had apparently never once worried about. He had underestimated her. She was going to make that his most expensive mistake. Rachel built her spreadsheet over 4 days. It was on a laptop Thomas had never seen, purchased with cash from a store 20 miles from her house. She mapped every LLC name Richard had given her, every property transaction she could pull from public records through the county clerk's websites and the Secretary of State business search, every connection between entities, every transfer she could document, every name associated with every filing. By the end of the 4th day, she had a document that Patricia Cole, who would later become her attorney, described as the single most useful piece of initial preparation she had ever received from a client. But she had not found Patricia Cole yet. She found her through Maggie, who found her through a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Patricia Cole was 53 years old and had spent 21 years at the intersection of financial fraud and domestic exploitation, the specific corner of the legal world where predatory partners and white-collar crime met. She had an office in Midtown Manhattan and a reputation that did not depend on who called her friends. Rachel reached her on a Thursday morning. She was driving home from a meeting with Patricia, full of the specific, cautious optimisms of a person who has finally found the right person to help them, when her phone rang. Her bank. "Ms. Calloway," the woman on the phone said, "I am calling about the business accounts." Her voice had the measured neutrality of someone delivering news that is not good. "We received notification this morning of a court order freezing all accounts associated with Calloway and Company Catering and Calloway Hospitality Group LLC, pending a financial fraud investigation." Rachel pulled over. She sat on the shoulders of the Sawmill River Parkway with her hazard lights blinking and listened to the rest of it. The accounts that held her payroll funds, her vendor payments, the balance she maintained for equipment costs, the reserves she kept for slow months, all of it inaccessible as of 7 that morning. Thomas had filed a complaint through the LLC he secretly controlled, claiming that Rachel had been misappropriating funds from the parent company without authorization. He had filed it that morning, before Rachel had left for her meeting with Patricia. He had known she was getting close. He had moved first. Rachel was still on the phone with the bank, asking questions that were not receiving answers, when her cell buzzed with a text from a number she did not recognize. She glanced at it. "This is Dr. Fletcher at Westchester Medical Center. Your son Owen Calloway was brought in following a car accident approximately 1 hour ago. Please call this number immediately." The sound of the parkway traffic seemed to come from very far away. She called back immediately. Owen had been a passenger in a friend's car on the interstate. Another driver had run a red light and struck the passenger side at highway speed. Owen had a broken collarbone, 2 fractured ribs, a concussion serious enough to require monitoring. He was awake. He was coherent. He was going to be okay. But he needed surgery to stabilize the collarbone. The estimated cost before insurance processing ran was $23,000. Rachel's business accounts were frozen. Her personal checking account had been flagged by the same court order as a potentially commingled account, meaning it was also inaccessible pending review. She had $340 in a savings account she had not touched in 2 years. She had a catering event in 72 hours with 8 staff members who expected to be paid. She sat on the shoulder of the parkway with her hazard lights blinking and the phone still in her hand, and she did not move for a long time. Not because she was broken, because she was calculating. She was figuring out, in real time, with the specific problem-solving part of her mind that had kept her company running through a recession and a pandemic and 14 years of the ordinary disasters that befall any business that actually exists. She was figuring out how to handle both of these things at once. I want to be honest with you about what this moment represents. This is what financial destruction looks like when it is done deliberately and by someone who knows you well. Not the dramatic version. Not the version where you know you are under attack and can defend yourself. The quiet, administrative version. Frozen accounts. A legal filing timed to the minute. A teenage boy in a hospital bed. A woman on the side of a road who built something real with her own hands and cannot reach a single dollar of it. This is the architecture of financial abuse. It leaves no bruises. It produces no evidence visible to people who are not looking for it. It is designed to look from the outside, like a legal process, like a dispute between 2 parties with competing claims. And it is devastatingly effective precisely because it is so invisible. If any part of what I am describing sounds like something you are living through right now, I want you to hear this clearly. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-799-7233. They have advocates who are specifically trained in financial abuse. They can help you understand your options without alerting your abuser. They can help you make a plan. Please call them. Please don't wait. Rachel didn't have that number then. She wishes she had. What she had was her phone and $340 and Maggie Sinclair's number. She called Maggie. Then she drove to the hospital. Owen looked smaller in the hospital bed than Rachel was prepared for. He was 17. He was 5'11". He had his father's jaw and Rachel's eyes, and the particular self-possession of a teenager who had grown up watching his mother run a business and had absorbed without knowing it the lesson that competent people do not panic. He was pale under the fluorescent lights, his left arm immobilized, an IV in his right hand. But he was awake, and he tracked her when she came into the room, and that was everything. She sat beside him and held his right hand and did not say anything for a while. There was nothing that needed to be said immediately. He was alive and he was going to heal, and that was the only fact that mattered in that moment. Maggie had arrived at the hospital within 40 minutes of Rachel's call. She had gone directly to the billing department and used a professional press credential in a way that was technically creative to buy Rachel time on the payment requirement, citing ongoing legal proceedings that would affect the insurance processing. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was enough to get Owen into surgery. Owen came through it well. When he woke from anesthesia, groggy and pale and surfacing slowly through the layers of sedation, he blinked at Rachel for a long moment and then said something she was completely unprepared for. Dad was here. Rachel kept her expression still when, while I was waiting for surgery, he shifted slightly and winced. He said you were having some business problems, legal stuff getting complicated. Rachel waited. He showed me some emails. Owen's voice was careful in the way teenagers get when they are saying something they sense is difficult and are trying to do it without causing more damage than necessary. His eyes were searching hers. From your account. Mom, your email address. Tell me what they said. They were conversations with someone about moving money before the accounts got frozen. Owen paused. They looked like you were trying to hide assets. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment. Thomas had either fabricated emails using her address or had accessed her account at some point and manufactured them from inside it. And he had brought those emails to a hospital, to a room where his 17-year-old son was lying with a broken collarbone and a concussion, still coming out of anesthesia, still disoriented and frightened, and most open to whatever his father told him was true. He had waited for the moment when Owen was most vulnerable, and he had used it. This is the third and lowest point of Rachel Calloway's story, not the discovery at the estate, not the frozen accounts. This, when someone weaponizes your child against you, they are making a very specific calculation. They are betting that the pain of watching your child look at you with uncertainty, with the tentative, searching expression of a person who is not quite sure who you are anymore, is the one pain you cannot function through. They are betting that your love for that child will make you stop. They understand, at least in theory, what love is capable of. They simply don't understand what it is capable of in the other direction. Rachel looked at her son in that hospital bed and understood something with absolute clarity. If she stopped now, Owen would grow up with Thomas's version of who Rachel was. He would carry that version with him into adulthood. He would make decisions based on it. He would measure himself against it. He would never know the truth about who his mother was, or what had been done to her, or what she had refused to accept. And Rachel was the only person who could make sure that didn't happen. She was not going to stop. She sat with Owen until he fell asleep. Then she went to the hallway and called Patricia Cole. The attorney answered on the second ring. She listened without interrupting while Rachel told her about the account freeze, the fabricated emails, Owen's hospital room. When Rachel finished, Patricia was quiet for exactly the right amount of time. This is one of the cleanest cases of financial abuse and fraud construction I have seen in 20 years of practice, she said. The LLC structure, the forged operating agreement, the asset freeze timed to your legal proceedings, the manufactured evidence delivered to a minor in a hospital. Thomas has left a paper trail that looks sophisticated but is fundamentally careless because he was counting on you never looking. What is our timeline? 3 weeks for preliminary injunctive relief. Federal court, financial fraud charges. Parallel bigamy filing with the district attorney's office. Your accounts unfrozen. He's frozen instead. The LLC restructuring voided by court order. 3 weeks. Rachel leaned against the hospital wall. I can do 3 weeks. She was wrong again. 48 hours later, Patricia called back. The voice was different. The precise, confident tone had been replaced by something careful and controlled in the way of a professional delivering news that the professional genuinely did not want to deliver. The presiding judge on our federal filing has recused himself, Patricia said. He cited a prior relationship with Thomas's legal team. The case has been reassigned. Rachel felt the cold arrive before Patricia finished the sentence. The new assigned judge, Patricia continued, has been under review by the Judicial Conduct Commission for the past 8 months for accepting gifts from parties connected to real estate litigation in Westchester and Rockland counties. Silence. Thomas managed to have your case assigned to a judge in his network, Patricia said. This does not stop us. It delays injunctive relief by 4 to 5 months. Patricia. Rachel's voice was very quiet. I have staff who need payroll in 60 hours. I have a son in the hospital with a bill I cannot currently pay. 4 to 5 months is not an option. I know. Genuine anguish in Patricia's voice. I am not stopping. I am telling you the obstacle so we can plan around it rather than into it. Rachel looked at the wall of the hospital corridor. She thought about the spreadsheet on the laptop Thomas had never seen. She thought about Richard Harmon's documents. She thought about everything she had mapped over 4 days in a kitchen at midnight. She thought about the deed of trust on the Westchester estate. Then she said, I think I know how we get around it. Rachel drove home from the hospital at 11 o'clock at night and sat at the kitchen table with the laptop no one else had touched and opened the spreadsheet. She was looking for one specific thing. Not the LLC structure, which Patricia already had. Not the bigamy documentation, which was assembled and ready. Something different. Something that bypassed the judicial appointment entirely. That removed the question of which judge heard the case from the equation altogether. She found it at 12:43 in the morning. The deed of trust on the Whitmore estate in Bedford, the property Thomas had used to host his vow renewal ceremony, the property that was, according to public records, owned by one of his LLCs, listed as collateral a portfolio of properties across 4 states, standard practice for a large real estate borrower with multiple assets. One of those properties was the commercial building in Westchester where Rachel's kitchen was located. Thomas had borrowed against her business location without her knowledge. He had pledged it as collateral for a loan secured by an LLC she had not knowingly authorized. And the lender on that deed of trust was a regional bank based in Connecticut. Rachel called Patricia at 6 in the morning. Patricia called her back at 6:22. Say that again, Patricia said. Thomas pledged the building where my kitchen is located as loan collateral through an LLC established with a forged operating agreement. The lender is holding security interest in an asset obtained through fraudulent instruments. Silence for 3 full seconds. We don't need the judge, Patricia said. We need the bank's compliance department. Rachel let out a breath she had been holding since the hospital corridor. Here is something important, and I want you to hear it not just as part of Rachel's story, but as something you can actually use. Public records are one of the most powerful tools available to anyone in a legal or financial dispute, and almost no one uses them. Property deeds are public record in every county in the United States. LLC registrations and corporate filings are publicly searchable through your state's Secretary of State website. Court filings are accessible through online systems in most jurisdictions. The information Thomas paid attorneys to hide inside complicated legal structures was still documented in public records that any person with internet access and a few hours could find. Search every business name connected to your spouse through your state's business record search. Pull every property transaction under their name through your county clerk's database. Cross-reference the names of any LLCs with the addresses and registered agents. Look for the same names appearing across multiple entities. There is almost always a thread. Finding it is the work. Rachel had found hers. Patricia filed with the bank's legal compliance department on a Friday afternoon. She included the deed of trust, the LLC operating agreement with Rachel's forged signature, and Richard Harmon's documented account of how the LLC had been established. The bank's response was faster than either of them anticipated. Regional banks, Patricia explained later, have significant regulatory exposure when they discover that collateral was secured through fraudulent instruments. They are legally required to notify their compliance team, their outside counsel, and the relevant federal regulators. They do not have the option of waiting to see how things develop. They act. By the following Monday morning, Thomas had a problem that existed entirely outside the court system, a problem that his fixer Wallace Pruitt had no mechanism to address, a problem that had been generated not by a filing in a court where judicial assignments could be manipulated, but by a bank's compliance department following mandatory regulatory protocols. And that problem, combined with the 6 years of documentation Richard Harmon had quietly preserved, combined with the bigamy evidence Rachel had compiled over 4 days of methodical searching, was about to lead somewhere Thomas had never once considered possible. Rachel called Maggie. "I think it's time," she said. Maggie understood immediately. "How much do you want to give them?" she said. "Everything," Rachel said. "All of it. Every document, every recording, every piece of the structure, mapped and sourced and verified. The bank will confirm the fraud side independently. Yes, and I want the family court angle, the custody threat, the fake emails in Owen's hospital room, all of it on the record." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "This is going to be very large," she said. "When this breaks, it breaks nationally." "I know. Are you ready for that?" Rachel thought about 14 years, about the kitchen at 5:47 in the morning, about her mother's chicken pot pie and the scholarship to Chapel Hill and the burn scar on her left forearm, about Owen's face in the hospital bed, searching hers, not quite sure who she was. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." The federal regulators who received the bank's compliance notification were from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the division of the Treasury Department that tracks and investigates money laundering and financial crimes infrastructure. They already had a file on Thomas Calloway, not because of the bigamy, not because of the LLC fraud Rachel had uncovered or the forged operating agreements Richard Harmon had documented, not even because of the fraudulent loan collateral that had triggered the bank's compliance filing. Because Thomas Calloway's real estate development projects had been flagged 3 years earlier as potentially providing laundering infrastructure for funds that were not of legitimate origin. Shell companies registered in Delaware and Wyoming. Transfer patterns that moved money through development entities in ways that obscured its source. Project valuations that did not match market conditions, but that made sense if the purpose was to move funds rather than develop properties. Thomas was not simply a con man running personal financial schemes against individual women. Thomas was providing the operational structure that allowed other people's money, money from sources that did not survive scrutiny, to enter the legitimate real estate market and emerge as clean capital. And those other people, the ones whose funds were cycling through Thomas's development projects, were the actual reason his connections ran as deep as they did, the reason attorneys withdrew without explanation, the reason judges could be reassigned through pressure on a conduct commission, the reason Richard Harmon had spent 2 years living quietly outside Poughkeepsie under a name that was slightly different from his own. Thomas hadn't built the firewall to protect himself from Rachel. He had built it because the people he was working with required it. And those people were significantly more dangerous than Thomas Calloway had ever been or would ever be. This is the detail that changes everything. The fact that reframes the entire shape of Rachel's experience. She had believed she was fighting one man, a predatory, calculating man who had deceived her and 4 other women and dozens of investors, and had used his resources to suppress any legal challenge she attempted. She was actually standing at the edge of something much larger, something that had been invisible to her because she had been inside it. inside the domestic outer layer of an operation that had nothing domestic at its center. The federal investigation that opened into Thomas Calloway's finances was not a family court proceeding. It was not a civil fraud action. It was a multi-agency criminal investigation with the specific scope and authority to freeze assets immediately, compel document production, and bypass the kind of local judicial relationships that Wallace Pruitt had spent 20 years cultivating. Within 6 days of the bank's compliance notification, Thomas's accounts were frozen, not Rachel's. Thomas's. His LLC assets were seized pending investigation. The Whitmore estate in Bedford was placed under a federal preservation order. Brianna Walsh, who investigators contacted within 48 hours, had not known about Rachel. This was the thing that took Rachel the longest to fully absorb. Brianna Walsh had genuinely believed, for 7 years, that she was legally married. She had lived inside the same kind of deception Rachel had lived inside, constructed just as carefully, maintained just as deliberately. She was, in the specific way that mattered, Rachel's mirror. Brianna cooperated fully with investigators in exchange for immunity. She provided 7 years of financial records and communications and documentation that Rachel's attorneys described as a complete operational roadmap of how Thomas had run his methodology across multiple relationships and multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. Thomas Calloway was arrested on a Tuesday morning outside his Philadelphia office by federal agents who did not announce themselves in advance and did not allow him the opportunity to call Wallace Pruitt before the handcuffs were on. He was charged with bigamy under Pennsylvania and New York law, financial fraud, money laundering conspiracy, 5 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of obstruction related to the Judicial Conduct Commission contact. The man who was led away from his Philadelphia office building looked nothing like the man who had walked into his kitchen at the Whitmore estate and calculated how to handle finding his wife there. He looked like exactly what he was, a person who had spent years believing that his resources made him untouchable, confronting, for the first time, the specific consequence of having been wrong about that. Maggie Sinclair's station broke the story that afternoon. By the following morning, it had been picked up by every major national outlet. The story of how Thomas Calloway's second wife and his first wife had, through a combination of financial documentation, public record research, a whistleblower's 6-year-old evidence, and a bank compliance filing, dismantled an operation that had eluded investigators for 3 years, became the kind of story that generates the specific public response reserved for revelations that feel both outrageous and inevitable. Rachel's phone did not stop ringing for 4 days. She did not answer most of the calls. She had more important things to do. The freeze on Rachel's business accounts was lifted within 4 days of Thomas's arrest. She was standing in the bank when it happened. The teller confirmed the restoration of access and told her the current balance. And Rachel nodded and said, "Thank you," and then stood at the counter for a moment longer than was strictly necessary because her eyes had filled and she was waiting for them to clear before she turned around and walked back into the rest of her life. She paid Owen's hospital bill that afternoon. She called her staff together the following morning, all 8 of them, in the commercial kitchen at 7 o'clock. And she told them everything, not because she owed them the story, because they had shown up for work during the weeks when she didn't know if she could make payroll. And they had done it without asking questions she couldn't answer yet. And they deserved to know why. Nobody spoke for a moment when she finished. Then Tyler, her lead server, said, "We figured something serious was going on." Rachel looked at him. "We just thought you'd tell us when you were ready," he said. The LLC structure Thomas had used to assume control of her company was voided by court order 3 weeks after his arrest, on the grounds of fraudulent formation. Calloway and Company Catering was Rachel's again, entirely, legally, permanently. The court order used the phrase as if the fraudulent restructuring had never occurred. Rachel read that phrase twice. as if it had never occurred, as if 14 years of something she had built with her own hands had always been entirely hers, because in the only way that actually mattered. It always had been. She pinned the court order to the bulletin board in her office. Not the wall, the bulletin board where she kept the week's event calendar and the staff schedule and the notes from her morning walkthroughs. She wanted to see it every day in the context of ordinary work, because ordinary work was the point. Ordinary work was the thing Thomas had tried to take and failed to take and would never have access to again. Owen took longer. The fabricated emails Thomas had shown him in the hospital were confirmed as manufactured by a forensic IT specialist within 72 hours of the investigation opening. The metadata was inconsistent. The server logs didn't match. Thomas had been sloppy in a way he might not have been if he hadn't been under pressure, if he hadn't been reacting rather than planning, which told Rachel that her move toward Patricia Cole and the bank had rattled him more than he let on. She sat with Owen at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon and walked him through the forensic report, page by page. She did not do it to prove a point. She did not do it because she needed him to apologize or to validate what she had been through or to take a side between his parents. She did it because her son was 17 years old and he deserved the truth, and the truth was something she could give him. He sat across from her and read the report carefully, the way he read things when he was taking them seriously. He showed me those emails while I was coming out of anesthesia, Owen said. His voice was very flat in the way of a teenager absorbing something that doesn't fit into any emotional category he has previously needed. I know. He timed it. Yes. Owen was quiet for a long time. He turned the last page of the forensic report and set it down and looked at his mother. I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions, he said. You had a broken collarbone and a concussion, Rachel said. You get a full pass on that one. He almost smiled. It was a small smile, tentative, the beginning of something, rather than the thing itself. But it was real. They ate dinner that night. Rachel made Carol Ann's chicken pot pie from scratch, the recipe she had been making since she was 12 years old, the one that required 3 hours and 4 bowls, and the specific patience of a person who understands that the best things cannot be rushed. She set 2 places at the kitchen table. They ate and they talked, and they did not resolve everything in one dinner. Because the truth is that the damage Thomas Calloway had done to his family was not something that healed in a single Sunday afternoon. It healed in the slow accumulation of ordinary evenings, the consistent, patient presence of a person who had always been there, demonstrating through the simple act of showing up again and again that she was still there. Rachel understood that. She was a caterer. She knew that the best things took time and repetition and care. Thomas Calloway was convicted on 11 of 14 counts. The jury deliberated for 2 days and returned verdicts that covered the financial fraud, the wire fraud, the bigamy, and 3 of the 5 obstruction counts. The money laundering conspiracy conviction carried the heaviest sentence. The judge at sentencing was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair who had spent 28 years on the federal bench and had seen most of what human beings were capable of doing to each other in the pursuit of money and power. She addressed Thomas directly before pronouncing the sentence, and her voice was entirely without drama, which somehow made it more devastating than if she had been angry. You spent years identifying people who trusted you, she said, and using that trust as a mechanism to take what they had built. You did it systematically, with planning and intention and resources. When any of your victims began to understand what had been done to them, you used additional resources to suppress their ability to seek justice. You used a judicial conduct commission as a personal instrument. You fabricated evidence and delivered it to a minor child in a hospital recovery room. She paused. You have expressed no genuine remorse. You have offered no accounting of the harm you have caused. Your behavior represents the clearest possible example of what happens when a person with access to legal and financial infrastructure decides that those tools exist to serve his interests rather than the interests of the society that created them. She sentenced him to 9 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole for the first 6. The gavel came down. Thomas was led out of the courtroom without looking at Rachel or at anyone else in the gallery. She had expected to feel something triumphant in that moment. The specific release of a person who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. What she felt instead was tired, profoundly, bone deeply tired, and ready. Ready to be done with this chapter and begin the next one. Richard Harmon's NDA was voided as part of the fraud proceedings. He received restitution from Thomas's seized assets, covering the lost salary and the legal costs of the confidentiality lawsuit Thomas had filed against him. He called Rachel the week after the sentencing. "I should have talked sooner," he said. "You talked when you could," Rachel said. "That's what matters." Brianna Walsh, who had cooperated fully with prosecutors, received a civil settlement from the Thomases' estate that allowed her to restart the Philadelphia design business she had operated under what she had believed was her legal married name. She sent Rachel a handwritten letter after the conviction, two pages, careful and honest, and not asking for anything. Rachel read it once on her front porch with coffee and then put it in a drawer. Some things don't need a response. Some wounds just need acknowledgement and time. The Westchester estate, once the federal asset recovery process completed its work, was liquidated as part of the restitution process. Rachel received a settlement that covered her legal costs. The business profits Thomas had redirected through the Callaway Hospitality Group LLC over 7 years, and compensatory damages that her attorney described as appropriate given the specific nature and duration of the exploitation. She used part of it to buy a house in Westchester County. 3 bedrooms, a small backyard that needed work, a kitchen that was older than she would have chosen if she was starting from scratch, a neighborhood where she had driven past the same elementary school every morning for 11 years without knowing that she was the person who would eventually be buying a house on that street. It was not a penthouse. It was not an estate. It would not impress anyone at the kind of dinner parties Thomas had spent years attending and hosting, but it was hers, completely and legally and permanently hers, not shared with an LLC she hadn't knowingly authorized, not collateralized against a loan she hadn't known existed, not held in the name of a man who had been calculating, for years, how to take it from her. She stood in the empty living room on the first day she owned it and held a cup of coffee and looked at the walls that needed paint and the floors that needed refinishing and the afternoon light coming through the west-facing windows at an angle that was going to be beautiful in the evenings. Owen was starting at NYU in the fall. He called her every Sunday without exception. Carol Ann's chicken pot pie was on the Callaway and Company menu. It outsold everything else by a significant margin. People called specifically to ask if it was available for their events. Rachel catered the state legislative committee's reception the evening after she testified about the LLC loopholes Thomas had exploited. She wore a navy blazer to the testimony and her kitchen clothes to the reception, and she thought that was exactly right. She made everything from scratch. "Before I let you go, I want to stay with you for a few more minutes, not to tell you more of Rachel's story, but to talk directly about what it means." What happened to Rachel Callaway was not unusual in the ways that matter most. The specific combination of bigamy and LLC, fraud and money laundering infrastructure is unusual. Yes, most people who experience what Rachel experienced don't find themselves at the intersection of a federal criminal investigation. Most betrayals are quieter. Most financial exploitation is less elaborately constructed. But the methodology, the underlying sequence of events, is not unusual at all. Identify someone who is capable and trusting. Gain their genuine emotional investment. use that investment to access what they are building. Exploit structures they don't fully understand to transfer what they have built to yourself. And when they begin to see clearly, use your resources to suppress their ability to respond. This happens in marriages. It happens in business partnerships. It happens in friendships and families and professional relationships. It happens to intelligent people and educated people and experienced people, specifically because the people who do this prefer capable targets. They need someone who is building something worth taking. Here is what I want you to carry from Rachel's story. First, financial literacy is not optional. It is self-defense. Rachel had her own business. She was a competent, experienced business person, and Thomas still managed to restructure that business out from under her, using legal instruments she didn't know to look for. The lesson is not to trust people less. The lesson is to know the legal architecture of your own financial life. Know which entities hold which assets. Know what your name is on and what it isn't. Know who has authority over what. Right now. Before you need this information, ask your accountant one question. Is there anything in our financial structure I should understand better? Ask your attorney one question. If something went wrong in this relationship tomorrow, what would my position be? The answers might be exactly what you expect, but they might not be. Knowing is always better than not knowing. Second, the people trying to exhaust you are counting on your exhaustion. Thomas's strategy at every phase. The withdrawn attorneys, the frozen accounts, the court manipulation, the emails in Owen's hospital room, was designed to make Rachel feel that the cost of continuing to fight was higher than the cost of surrendering. This is deliberate. It is not accidental. People with more resources than their opponents use delay and escalation specifically as weapons, because they are betting that you will run out of energy before they run out of money. The antidote is not to match their resources. You rarely can. The antidote is to find the one thread they did not think to protect, the one connection they overlooked, the one public record they forgot was public, the one person who has been sitting on the truth and waiting for someone to ask. There is almost always a thread. Pulling it is the work. Third, your network is your first responder, not your attorney, not the court system. Your people. Maggie Sinclair found Richard Harmon. Richard Harmon had the documents. Patricia Cole knew how to use them. The bank compliance filing happened because Rachel understood her own spreadsheet well enough to find the deed of trust. None of it happened alone. None of it was possible alone. If you are in the middle of something that feels like Rachel's story, please reach out to a trusted person who has something to offer, whether that is information or access or a couch to sit on at 3 in the morning, to an attorney who specializes in your specific situation, even if it takes 3 tries to find the right one, to an advocate who understands financial abuse and can help you see clearly when the situation has been specifically designed to make clear thinking difficult. Fourth, document everything before you move anything. Every financial statement, every email, every document you have ever signed, every text message that matters. Photograph them. Send them to an email account your partner doesn't know exists. Store them somewhere you control entirely. A safe deposit box in your name alone. A trusted friend's house. A secure cloud account with the password only you know. Do this quietly. Do this now. Not because you are certain something is wrong, because you deserve to know the complete picture of your own life, and because the time to build a record is before you need it, not after. Rachel Calloway is 53 years old. She runs a catering company that employs 22 people and has a client list that includes some of the same Fortune 500 companies she worked with before any of this happened, along with a number of new clients who found her specifically because of who she turned out to be when things got hard. Owen graduates from NYU in 2 years. He is studying journalism. Rachel suspects he will be very good at it, for reasons that are not unrelated to everything that happened when he was 17. Her mother, Carol Ann's chicken pot pie, is on the permanent menu and on the wall of Rachel's office, next to the weekly event calendar and the staff schedule and the notes from her morning walkthroughs, is the court order voiding the Callaway Hospitality Group LLC restructuring, the one that uses the phrase as if the fraudulent restructuring had never occurred. She sees it every morning. She built her life once from nothing, in a city that didn't know her name, with calluses on her hands, and a scholarship, and a recipe for chicken pot pie, and the specific, unshakable belief that feeding people well was one of the most meaningful things a person could do. Then someone tried to take what she had built, and she built it again, this time with a complete understanding of its legal architecture, this time with her name on every document that mattered, verified and unambiguous, this time with a network of people who had stood beside her through the hardest phase and who understood, with precision, what she was capable of. She is enough. She has always been enough. And anyone who ever made her doubt that only revealed, in the end, their own estimation of what they themselves could become without taking something from someone else. That is the truest thing I can tell you about Thomas Callaway. He needed what Rachel had built because he could not build it himself. He needed her name on his documents because his name alone was not sufficient. He needed her foundation because without it, he was nothing but the next failing startup in a long line of them. The man she had met at a charity auction who had more ambition than anything to back it up. Rachel gave him a foundation. He took it, and then she built another one. That is the story. That is the whole of it. If it moved you, share it with someone who might need it tonight. You don't have to explain why, just send it. Sometimes a story arrives at exactly the right moment, and you don't always know in advance whose moment it is. If anything in Rachel's story felt too close to your own life, please reach out for support. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at 1-800-799-7233. They have advocates who specialize in financial abuse, and they can help you understand your options without requiring you to make any decisions you are not ready to make. You are not alone in this. If you found value in this story, a like or a subscription helps more stories like this one reach people who need them. Leave a comment. Tell me what resonated. This community is built on real connection, and your voice matters here more than you might know. And one final note before you go. Nothing in this story constitutes legal, financial, or professional advice. Rachel's story is presented for storytelling and informational purposes only. If you are experiencing domestic abuse, financial exploitation, or a legal situation similar to what has been described here, please consult a licensed attorney in your state and reach out to the appropriate support resources. Laws vary by state and by circumstance. The National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233 and the National Network to End Domestic Violence's Economic Justice Resources can connect you with advocates trained specifically in cases involving financial abuse. Your safety matters. Take care of yourself. I will see you in the next story. Rachel Callaway did not win because she was lucky. She did not win because she had more money than Thomas, or better lawyers, or an easier situation than you might be facing right now. She won because she refused to accept the story someone else was writing about her life, and she started writing her own. I want to sit with you for a few more minutes before we part, because I think there are things inside Rachel's story that are worth carrying with you long after this video ends. The first thing is this. The most dangerous lies are never the obvious ones. They are the ones wrapped in love, the ones embedded inside 19 years of Sunday mornings and shared grocery lists and a child you raised together. No one is naive for believing those lies. No one is foolish for trusting someone they built a life with. If Rachel's story teaches us as anything about the nature of deception, it is that the most sophisticated deceptions are constructed specifically to be invisible to the people closest to them. You did not miss something you should have seen. You trusted someone who was working very hard to make sure you couldn't see clearly. That is not your failure. That is their crime. The second thing, every person who tries to destroy you is making a bet. They are betting that the cost of fighting back is higher than the cost of surrendering. They are betting that if they freeze your accounts and pressure your attorneys and show your child fabricated evidence in a hospital room, you will eventually decide that it is easier to accept their version of events than to keep pushing against it. They are counting on your exhaustion. And the most powerful thing you can do, the thing that Rachel did, is to find the one place where their calculation is wrong, the one thread they forgot to protect, the one document sitting in a public record database that they assumed you would never think to look for, the one person who has been waiting for years for someone to ask the right question. There is always a thread. Your job is to find it and then to pull. The third thing, nobody wins alone. Not Rachel. Not anyone. Maggie showed up with press credentials and 16 years of investigative instinct. Richard Harmon sat in a diner in Poughkeepsie and handed over an envelope he had been carrying for 6 years. Patricia Cole filed on a Friday afternoon in a direction no one expected. Owen, at 17 years old, with a broken collarbone and a concussion, looked at his mother and said, "I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions." And in that single sentence, gave Rachel something that no legal victory could have provided. If you are in the middle of your own impossible situation right now, please hear this clearly. You do not have to figure it out alone. The people who belong in your corner are looking for a way in. Let them find one. And the fourth thing, perhaps the most important, Rachel Calloway did not become someone different in order to win. She did not have to harden herself into something unrecognizable. She did not have to match cruelty with cruelty or manipulation with manipulation, or become the thing she was fighting in order to defeat it. She won by becoming more fully herself, more organized, more precise, more willing to ask questions she was afraid of the answers to, more clear-eyed about the value of what she had built, and the absolute refusal to let someone else's assessment of that value become her own. The chicken pot pie is still on the menu. She still shows up before dawn. She still believes that feeding people well is one of the most meaningful things a person can do. Thomas Calloway spent 9 years in a federal prison, trying to become something worth having. Rachel Calloway spent 1 year remembering that she already was. That is the whole lesson. That is the entire thing. You are enough. You have always been enough. And anyone who ever made you doubt, that only revealed, in the clearest possible way, exactly how much they needed something you had and could not build for themselves. If this story meant something to you tonight, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. You do not need to explain why. Just send it. Sometimes a story arrives at exactly the right moment, and you will not always know in advance whose moment it is. Leave a comment below and tell me what resonated. Your voice in this community matters more than you know. And if you are not yet subscribed, please do it now. Every week, we bring you stories like this one. Stories that are worth your time. Stories that might change something. We will see you in the next one. Final closing statement. This content was carefully researched, thoughtfully developed, and manually written and edited by our team with one purpose in mind: to bring you stories that carry real meaning, real lessons, real value for your life. We believe that stories have power, the power to help you see something you needed to see, the power to remind you of something you already knew but had forgotten, the power to arrive at exactly the right moment and change the direction of something important. Every word in this story was chosen deliberately. Every lesson was drawn from real patterns in real human experience. Nothing here was generated carelessly or without regard for the people who would listen to it. Because you deserve content that respects your time, your intelligence, and your life. Thank you for being here. We will see you in the next story.